Pro-Syrian regime forces enter Afrin, but the Turkish military fights back. Could Ankara and Damascus be on the verge of war? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the militia that calls itself the Syrian Popular Forces. After days of speculation, they finally made their move on Afrin. A Shia militia reached the Syrian city, waving regime flags and chanting slogans in support of Bashar al-Assad. But they weren't there for long. After Turkish shelling pushed them back, Ankara had previously warned Assad's forces against moving in to support the YPG. But the YPG said they'd struck a deal with the regime for their help in repelling Turkish forces. Yet Turkey's president says in this instance, the militia was just a rogue terror group acting independently. Nevertheless, Turkish leadership has sent out a message. Anyone who tries to help Turkey's enemies in Afrin will face serious consequences. Shoaib Hassan reports.
Arriving to save the YPG and further complicate the conflict, these militias loyal to the Syrian regime defied warnings and stormed into Afrin. They intended to provide backup to the forces fighting Turkey.
We are the Syrian Popular Forces, and we have come here to support our people, the civilians in Afrin. We came to Afrin because we are one. We are one Syrian people.
Turkey immediately responded with artillery shelling and says the pro-regime fighters have now been forced back. It's part of Turkey's Operation Olive Branch, which aims to drive back the YPG terror group from its border with Syria. The offensive began in January with the goal of taking the YPG-controlled Afrin and Tal Rifat regions. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Turkish forces have now cleared 300 square kilometers of Syrian territory. It's a tricky situation for Ankara, with US, Russian and Iran-backed regime forces all based nearby. The concern is that Turkish army could come head-to-head with Assad's forces for the first time, and that would only escalate the fighting. But Turkey's president said after a discussion with Russian and Iranian leaders that the situation for now is under control.
Dün gerek Sayın Putin'le yaptığımız görüşme, Sayın Ruhani'yle yaptığımız görüşmelerde bu konularda da zaten mutabakatımız var. Maalesef bu tür terör örgütlerinin bazen biliyorsunuz kendilerine göre aldıkları kararlarla attıkları yanlış adımlar oluyor. Bunlara tabii fırsat vermemiz mümkün değil. Bunun bedelini de çok ağır öderler.
But there's the risk things could get heated again, as Ankara intends to push on towards Manbij, a YPG stronghold where US forces are also based. Could that bring the deteriorating relationship between the two NATO allies crashing down? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Arezzo in Italy is Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Oklahoma University. In Brussels, we have Yahya Al-Aridi. He's the spokesman for the opposition group, the Syrian Negotiations Commission. And from Paris is Can Kasripoğlu. He's a defense analyst at the Center for Economic and Foreign Policy Research, a think tank focusing on Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Joshua Landis. This Shia militia injecting itself into the conflict in Afrin and then being repelled, what do you make of it? Is it a sign of things to come? Is it dangerous?
It is dangerous. It means that Turkey could potentially be fighting the Syrian army, and that would be backed up by Russia. Clearly, negotiations, which have been going on for over a month, even before the Turkish invasion of Afrin, have been bumpy. For a while, we thought that Syria would go in and Turkey would accept it. But now Turkey is saying, no, the Syrian army is coming in to help the YPG. So much will depend on whether the Syrians can disarm the YPG, which is in Syria's interest and could be in Turkey's interest as well, to find a solution that would avoid more bloodshed.
Yahya, has this given us an indication that the YPG and the regime might actually be on the same page and possibly working together, as reports have suggested?
Okay, well, we have to look into the roots of this problem. You know, when the uprising started in Syria in 2011, PYD, which is an affiliate of PKK, took somehow the Kurdish issue in general somehow hostage to its own intentions and to its own plans, and didn't share the Syrian people in their uprising. And there came a point when it turned into some sort of a threat at the Turkish southern borders, and at the same time took those areas and the people there, taking advantage of their plight historically at the hands of the Assad regime, and started to manipulate the situation. And there came a point where the Turks felt that their national security was threatened, and in cooperation with the Free Syrian Army, they wanted to liberate these areas from their domination. That is what is happening. And now it transpires that they are coordinating with the Syrian regime itself. And when they felt that they are pressured by the Turks and the Free Syrian Army, they contacted the militias of the regime and the Iranian ones, and they wanted to, they asked them to come in, which could create or escalate the tension more and more. And Syria doesn't really need more bloodshed.
John, do you think that Turkey might be at risk of having a smaller fight against one group turning into a much bigger fight against many groups?
Actually, no. At this point, no, because the Syrian regime elite forces have a large concentration right now in eastern Ghouta. Also a small proportion of the Syrian elite units, which are really combat capable, are now in Idlib. So what Damascus can send to Afrin right now is the militia force. I don't think that that would be a big problem for Turkey. As we saw yesterday, the Turkish artillery fire to a great extent managed to deter the incoming militia into Afrin. But I can put one reserve here, which is not the Syrian militia, but the Syrian air defenses. Especially after the capture of the Abu Duhur air base. Right. We know that the Syrian air defenses are now robust and formidable in the area. But Russia is in control of the Syrian airspace. So as long as the Turkish-Russian rapprochement is going well diplomatically, I don't think that that would go beyond the limits of a rhetorical escalation.
Joshua Landis, is that what is happening right now? The Syrian regime sending its elite forces to eastern Ghouta, where, you know, the UN is calling it unbelievable, unimaginable, barbaric, and so on. Hundreds of people are dying. It's a terrible situation there. Is that what's happening? They're sending elite forces there, and they're sending Shia militias for hire to places like Afrin to maybe keep Turkey busy?
Well, it's true that the other regions, the Ghouta around Damascus, as well as Idlib, have been priorities for the Syrian regime. That's absolutely true, and they don't have unlimited sources. But the downside for Turkey is, of course, that these are Syrian fighters. And if you kill Syrians, increasingly, Syria is going to get dragged into this conflict. That is not good for Turkey. Turkey does not want to go to war against the Syrian army because Russia will be forced to take sides. And even though there's an understanding, already we saw Erdogan say that he might talk to Assad in extreme situations. Yeah. This is a change. It's a change that's good for Russia. It's good for Assad. So Russia and Assad are using the Afrin situation to force Erdogan's hand into making some concessions, both to Assad, to Russia, and elsewhere, because Turkey does not want to get bogged down in a fight in Afrin where civilians begin to die, and it looks like the Ghouta. And you just described the Ghouta in horrible terms. It's doing no good for Syria in the international realm. And Turkey is going to take the same kind of beating if this war gets nasty.
Yeah. So John, might Moscow be pulling the strings here where, you know, as was mentioned by Joshua Landis, Ibrahim Kalin came out, he said, yes, Turkey might talk to the regime under extraordinary conditions to solve certain issues. Clearest indication yet that Ankara might actually talk to the regime. Is Russia using this opportunity to get Turkey to talk to Bashar al-Assad?
Of course, since the beginning, it was, I think, the Russian position to renormalize Turkish-Syrian relations, to give more legitimacy to Assad, their client, in international arena, not vis-a-vis Turkey only. But I think in international arena, Russia wants that kind of way forward for Syria. But the important thing here is compartmentalization of Turkey's position. In extreme cases, Turkey can talk, as the government officials underlined, with the Syrian regime or the representatives of the Syrian regime, but that would be strongly framed by either a humanitarian agenda with regards to the civilians in Afrin, or a security agenda with regards to the extreme cases that would need urgent intervention. Apart from that, when it comes to political dialogue, when it comes to restoring the diplomatic ties, I don't think that Russia has what it gets to force Turkey's hand to that extent.
Yahya, what do you think was said during those phone calls between the presidents Erdogan, Rouhani, and Putin? We need to make sure we're all on the same page?
Well, they are trying to be reading from the same page, those three, be it Turkey, Iran, and Russia. However, as your guest said, it is difficult to just normalize relations between Turkey and the Syrian regime. It is even immoral, because there were many statements on the part of Turkey describing the atrocities being perpetrated. Russia may have interest in achieving this goal, but actually it cannot. Now, there is this tripartite sort of relationship which could turn into certain points into points of conflict. Now, you know, they are amongst themselves trying to be close, each two together at the expense of the other. So this is not a normal relationship between these three. However, the Assad regime is taking advantage of such ill or sick relationship and promoting its existence, or trying to remain in power as long as possible. And your guests also mentioned Al-Ghouta. Al-Ghouta mass murder is taking place these days with the Assad militias supported by the Iranian ones, and with the Russian support from the skies. Now, this bombardment taking place and the mass murder taking place is unprecedented in the past 2 days. If the term Holocaust is to be used again, I believe it can be used in Al-Ghouta today. Now, other areas in Syria are in turmoil continuously, and the more tension there is, the longer the life of this brutal regime is. So the world should come to a point of understanding that the source of tension, be it the Kurdish issue, the population, the people issue, the Syrian people's issue, the displacement of people, all these things need to be taken into consideration, and that the world has to come to an understanding that this regime is the best prescription for the continuation of tension, and it could turn out into something more horrible. This is our understanding, and all the parties, especially in the international community, the Security Council, should come to an understanding that this whole saga should end.
Joshua Landers, before I let you go, let me ask you about the Iranians. There are those who believe this latest example of that militia marching on Afrin is showing that the Iranians are getting even more muscular when it comes to the Syrian conflict. Is that true?
Well, clearly, Assad's win is a win for Iran and for Russia. The three are partners working together in the same way that the Arab rebels are working with Turkey to attack Afrin. So in that sense, everything that helps Assad helps Iran, which clearly will upset the United States, which is trying to roll back Iran, in Syria. These militias are Syrians, of course. They are not Iranians, but Iran supports the Assad government, and that's a very important alliance. There's no doubt about it. So it does help Iran for Assad to remain in power and to impose his sovereignty over additional districts inside Syria. And that's what we're seeing. What we're seeing now is at the end of ISIS, there was a broad agreement to just attack ISIS. Now that ISIS has been destroyed, each country, major country, is trying to grab as much land from the rebels as they can. The United States has taken 30% of Syria in the north. Assad is trying to grab the Ghouta now, Der'a, up near the Golan Heights, and of course Idlib. But Turkey does not want to be left out. And Turkey wants a long band of territory, a contiguous band of territory, to connect together everything west of the Euphrates, Afrin, moving down towards Idlib. And so the potential for conflict with Assad and the Russians is considerable, because the Russians and Syrians are trying to limit the amount of territory that Turkey can take. And Turkey, of course, is trying to sidestep this and continue with pushing around and getting a border zone that would be a large contiguous buffer zone around the edge of Syria. And so this is the end game in a sense. The rebellion is dead, but the major powers, America, Turkey, Russia, and Syria, are all trying to take as much of the remaining rebel land as they possibly can.
Well, there are those who believe it's going to get much uglier before it gets better. That's where we leave you, Joshua Landis. We're going to say goodbye to Joshua Landis and bring in Lawrence Korb now. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and is now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Larry Korb, thanks for joining us on the show. I wonder, does Washington feel maybe that it's backing the wrong horse when it sees a group like the YPG making contact with the regime, making contact with Shia militias, which are controlled by the Iranians? Might Washington be getting itself further entangled in a big mess now?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the United States is unhappy that the people we've supported, the YPG, to help fight ISIS, now are making common cause with the Assad government and indirectly with Russia and Iran. And that's why I think it's very important for the United States and Turkey to get together to figure out, what's going to be the next steps. Unfortunately, the Turks went into areas controlled by the groups we had supported without consulting with the United States and working out some sort of rules of engagement.
Is that fair, John?
Well, I think this issue has two dimensions. The first dimension is about larger international relations context. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey and United States. I personally value Turkish-American relations to a great extent. Turkey and United States worked in Afghanistan together, in Bosnia together, in Kosovo together, 1990s, in Afghanistan in the 2000s, in the NATO operations in Libya, in Lebanon. United States of America is the major primary power within the NATO alliance. United States foreign policy cannot be framed in a very narrow context of Syria that PYD can only offer. Whereas, on the other hand, Turkey can offer a broad array of cooperation, security and defense cooperation options to Washington, ranging from the Balkans to the Central Asia. This is the strategic dimension of the issue. When it comes to the tactical dimension of the issue, we see that there is an organic tie between the PKK terrorist organization, which is also designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, and YPG. It is not only the Turkish sources claiming that, even the academic studies done in the US universities are showing this very fact. I think we need an adjustment both in the strategic and the tactical dimension of the Turkish-American bilateral ties. And I think the Tillerson visit, the recent Tillerson visit, gave us some optimism about that.
Okay, so Larry Korb, is Washington willing to make that adjustment for its NATO ally?
Well, Well, I think it is. And again, we're talking about, Afrin here, which the Turks went in without consulting us. We have not provided as much support as the YPG thinks it deserves, given, how much they have expended in fighting ISIS, which is why they're willing to make arrangements with the Syrian government. And I think if we could work out some, as I say, rules of the game, particularly west of the Euphrates, then I think we could come to, an agreement. But the fact of the matter is, by Turkey going into Afrin, basically without working out the details with us, they put us in an impossible position. And as has been pointed out, the winners here are Assad, Russia, and Iran. They're the ones who are winning there. And so the United States and Turkey, who have been traditional allies, we still have a base at Incirlik, we need to work it out so we can ensure that we have our interests. But right now, with what's happening in Afrin, we're giving the Syrians an excuse, the Syrian government an excuse to come into an area that they weren't controlling before.
Let me give Yahya al-Aridi the final word here, because unfortunately we are out of time, but I want to add another 45 seconds or so to this. Yahya, as a member of the Syrian opposition who wants change, who wants Assad to go, who wants to see this war come to an end, how do you feel about the Turkish relationship with the United States? They have this volatile marriage. Does it matter to you as a member of the Syrian opposition whether they are experiencing tension or whether they are at peace with each other?
Well, the 45 seconds have been consumed by your question, but let me just comment on your guest's statements and the whole general issue. Actually, everybody is talking about countries, the United States, Russia, Turkey, Iran, the Syrian regime, etc., etc., and nobody is talking about the plight of Syrian people in general who have been victim to all those vicious and bloody and criminal interests of those countries who have interfered. First of all, we had the pretext of terrorism created by the regime and those who supported it, and it was the fight against the people themselves who said no to this regime. And later on, we had all these powers coming into Syria and starting conflicting with each other, and all at the expense of Syrian people, their land, their dignity, their life, etc., etc. Nobody is talking about this. Whether I'm in the opposition or in the other side, and just to evaluate the relationship between the United States and Turkey. Now, they are strategically friends. Turkey is part of NATO, and the United States cannot have any shaking of this relationship with Turkey. But at the same time, all the parties, be they Russia, Turkey, United States, should care about Syrian people. This is the most important thing for us. We want them to be happy with each other, but not at our expense. This is the point. And nobody is paying attention to this. The victims in Al-Ghouta today are similar to those who have been victims to the Holocaust. And nobody is using even that word. Nobody is paying attention to those people. Talk, and interests and conflict inside the Syrian arena, and nobody is paying attention to half of the country being displaced, to 1 million people being killed, to half million being still in the Assad regime's jail. This is the real issue that needs to be talked about, not the interests of countries conflicting with each other in that horrible arena brought by the Assad regime. This is the point.
Sir, passionately put, and you're all always welcome to return to the program. For the moment, I have to move on. Yahya, John, Larry, and earlier Joshua, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.